History Secrets.
In ancient Jewish traditions, there are accounts that do not appear in the most well-known biblical texts, stories preserved in ancient manuscripts, transmitted over the centuries. And one of those stories speaks of beings called Watchers. But who were they? And why is their presence so unsettling? The Book of Enoch, an ancient text attributed to the patriarch Enoch, presents a narrative that does not appear in detail in the traditional Bible. Although the book is not considered canonical in most traditions, it was widely known in the ancient Jewish world, and its ideas deeply influenced the way certain groups understood the spiritual world. To understand who the Watchers were, we need to begin with an enigmatic passage. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. There, it speaks of the so-called sons of God, beings who relate to the daughters of men and generate offspring, the so-called giants. But the biblical text does not explain who these beings are. It does not detail. It does not develop. It only mentions and continues. Something there seems incomplete. It is precisely in that space that the Book of Enoch expands. It offers a more elaborate narrative, more detailed, more direct. According to this text, the Watchers were angels, celestial beings, assigned to observe humanity, to watch, to accompany. But something happens, something that completely changes the course of history. These beings do not only observe, they descend to earth, and they make a decision that breaks the established order. They relate to human women, and from this union, the Nephilim are born, beings described as giants, but also as figures of great strength and influence. Something there becomes disturbing. The Watchers do not only cross a boundary, they transform the human world. According to the Book of Enoch, they teach forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, magic, astrology, weapons, practices that alter the structure of society. This raises an important question. Were these forms of knowledge considered progress or corruption? In Enoch's narrative, the answer is clear. This knowledge leads to violence, to imbalance, to destruction. The earth becomes filled with injustice, with chaos, with suffering. But who led these Watchers? The text mentions names, among them Azazel, Semi-Hazah, leaders of a group that chooses to act. That establishes a pact. That assumes a collective commitment. This is significant because it indicates intention, planning, awareness of the act. Something there was not accidental. It was deliberate. The Watchers knew the consequences, and even so, they moved forward. But there's an even deeper point. The Book of Enoch does not present these beings only as rebels. It presents them as responsible for altering the balance between the divine and the human. They bring heaven to earth, but in a disordered way, without authorization, without limit. This creates a rupture, a fracture in the structure of creation, and it is precisely this rupture that, according to the text, leads to the flood, an attempt to restore order. To understand this, we need to consider the role of Enoch. In tradition, he is not only a patriarch, he is a mediator, someone who moves between worlds, who receives revelations, who witnesses events invisible to others. In the book of Enoch, he is called to intercede, to listen to the watchers, and to bring their plea to God. But the response is not favorable. The watchers will not be forgiven. They will be judged, chained, condemned. Something there reveals a clear message. There are limits, and when those limits are crossed, the consequences are inevitable. But perhaps you are wondering, should this story be understood literally or symbolically? Some ancient traditions interpreted the watchers as fallen angels. Others suggest they represent corrupt human leaders, or even metaphors for knowledge used in a destructive way. This shows that the text does not have a single reading. It opens space for interpretation. And this leads us to an important point. The Book of Enoch should not be treated as a canonical text in most tradition, but as a historical document, a window into the religious thinking of a specific period. It reveals concerns, fears, attempts to explain evil, to understand the origin of human corruption. Something there remains relevant. The idea that knowledge can be used destructively, that crossing limits has consequences, that not everything that is possible should be done. The Watchers, in that sense, cease to be only ancient characters and become symbols of rupture, of excess, of imbalance. And perhaps that is why this narrative continues to intrigue. It does not offer simple answers, but raises profound questions about power, about knowledge, about responsibility. Something there still resonates. Who observes whom? And what happens when the observer decides to act? If we go even deeper into this narrative, we perceive that the role of the Watchers is not limited to the initial transgression. There is an ongoing consequence, a chain of effects that extends beyond the act itself. The Book of Enoch describes that after the union between the Watchers and human women, the Nephilim begin to dominate the earth. They are not only large, they are insatiable. They consume resources. They subjugate humans. And when nothing remains, they turn against each other. Violence grows without control. Something there goes beyond the limits of symbolic narrative. The description points to a world out of balance, where the natural order has been broken and can no longer restore itself. But there is a fundamental detail. The problem is not only the Nephilim, it is the knowledge left by the Watchers. This knowledge remains, even after destruction. This suggests something profound. The impact of the Watchers does not end with them. It continues through what was transmitted. According to the text, Azazel teaches humans to forge weapons. Swords, knives, shields. He also teaches metalworking and the creation of ornaments. But the text does not present this as progress. It presents it as the origin of corruption. Other watchers teach astrology, enchantments, interpretation of celestial signs, knowledge that, in other traditions, might be seen as wisdom, but here it takes on another meaning. Something there is redefined. Knowledge is not neutral. It can be an instrument of imbalance, depending on how it is used. This raises a question that spans centuries. Is the problem the knowledge itself, or the way it is applied? The text does not answer directly, but it suggests a direction. When knowledge breaks ethical boundaries, it ceases to be construction and becomes destruction. Another important point is the divine reaction described in the book of Enoch. Instead of an immediate response, there is a process, an observation, an evaluation, until judgment is decreed. The watchers are condemned, bound, confined, awaiting final judgment. This creates a powerful image. Beings who once observed humanity, now imprisoned, unable to act. Something there is reversed. The observer becomes contained. The agent becomes passive. But there is a detail that makes this narrative even more complex. The spirits of the Nephilim do not disappear. According to the text, they remain on earth. They become wandering spirits, influencing humanity, generating conflict, disorder. This introduces a new layer, the idea that certain problems are not eliminated, only transformed. To understand this, we need to consider the symbolic context. These spirits may represent internal forces, human tendencies, impulses that are difficult to control, or they may reflect ancient beliefs about the spiritual world. Once again, the text does not close itself into a single interpretation. It remains open. Perhaps you are perceiving that the story of the Watchers is not only about celestial being, but about limits, transgression, consequence. And this brings us to a crucial point. Why was this narrative preserved? The book of Enoch circulated widely among certain Jewish groups, especially during the Second Temple period. It was read, copied, transmitted. This indicates relevance, importance, impact. But over time, it ceased to be included in most religious canon. It was marginalized, classified as apocryphal, and that is also significant. Something it was considered incompatible, or perhaps dangerous, or simply beyond the scope of official tradition. But even outside the canon, its ideas did not disappear. They continued influencing interpretations, traditions, and even later texts. This reveals something important. Not everything that is excluded ceases to exist. Some ideas remain, circulate, transform. And perhaps that is precisely why the Watchers continue to be discussed. They represent something that cannot be easily resolved, a tension between the divine and the human, between what is permitted and what is forbidden. And this leads us to an inevitable reflection. If the Watchers symbolize the breaking of limits, then what are the limits that still exist? And who defines them? Something there remains open, and perhaps it must remain so, because it is in that space that inquiry continues. If we gather all these elements, an even stronger question emerges. What is actually being described in the story of the Watchers? A literal event? A metaphor? Or an ancient attempt to explain something deeper? The Book of Enoch does not answer directly, but it offers layers, and each one opens a new possibility of interpretation. In a literal reading, the Watchers would be celestial beings who descended to earth, who intervened in the human world and caused a rupture in the order of creation. This interpretation was adopted by some ancient traditions and still has defenders today. But there is another possibility, a symbolic reading in which the Watchers represent human leaders, figures of power, who abused their position and corrupted society. In this context, forbidden knowledge can be understood as practices that led to inequality, to violence, to manipulation. Something there ceases to be supernatural and becomes historical, social, human. But there is yet a third layer, a psychological reading, more subtle, more internal. The Watchers could represent aspects of the human mind itself, impulses, desires, tendencies that observe, and that, at a certain moment, stop observing and begin to act. This completely transforms the narrative. The conflict ceases to be external. And becomes internal. Something there shifts from heaven to consciousness. And the Nephilim, in this context, could symbolize the consequences of those actions. Amplified results, forces that grow beyond control. This reading does not deny the others, but adds a dimension. It shows that the text can operate on multiple levels at the same time. To understand this, we must remember that ancient texts were not written with the same modern logic. They combined history, symbol, theology, experience, all within the same narrative flow. This explains why the story of the Watchers continues to be reinterpreted. Each era reads it differently. Each tradition highlights one aspect. Something there remains alive, not because it offers fixed answers, but because it allows new questions. And this brings us to the final point, reflection. If the Watchers represent the breaking of limits, if they symbolize the misuse of knowledge, if they point to inevitable consequences, then the narrative does not belong only to the past. It projects itself into the present. What happens when the human being exceeds his own limits? When he transforms knowledge into uncontrolled power? When he stops observing and begins to act without awareness? Something there repeats, in different forms, in different contexts. Perhaps that is why this story never completely disappeared. It keeps returning, reappearing, being rediscovered. Because at its core, it does not speak only about angels, nor about giants. It speaks about something closer, more immediate, more human. Responsibility. And perhaps that is the final question that remains. What do we do with what we know? Each historical discovery reveals new clues, but also raises new questions. Because when it comes to the past, there is always something we still do not understand. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.